Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Free Man Beyond the Wall podcast. This is your host, Pete Raymond. I invited Alan Mendenhall to come on the show. Alan is Associate Dean and Executive Director at the Blackstone Center for Law and Liberty at Faulkner University Thomas Goode Jones School of Law. He is also a Mises Fellow. Alan wrote an article for Mises Wire recently called "The United States is Not a Nation: The Problem with National Conservatism." He was responding to the recent National Conservatism conference that happened in Washington, D.C., that had people like Tucker Carlson and John Bolton. So Alan penned this article. It has been shared a lot. He said it's probably one of his widest articles ever and most commented on. And I wanted to give Alan a chance to come on and teach us exactly what he's talking about when he says that the United States is not a nation. So without any further delay, here is Alan Mendenhall. Alan Mendenhall, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. I asked you to come on because you had written an article recently, and plus we were talking at Mises University and tried to drag you into the studio to record a podcast, but that didn't happen because, that's a chaos week. But I saw this article that you wrote on 731 for Mises Wire, and I thought this was a great topic. But before we get into the topic of this, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Well, sure. I am an Associate Dean at Faulkner University Thomas Goode Jones School of Law in Montgomery, Alabama. I direct the Blackstone and Burke Center for Law and Liberty, which is housed in the law school. We do educational programming for judges. We run a fellowship program for students, and then we do just general educational programming where we go into schools. We will go into communities and basically teach philosophy, jurisprudence, and even a little bit of Austrian economics.
All right, so let's get into this article. And it looks like one of the inspirations for this article was the recent National Conservatism conference they had in Washington, D.C. that featured such luminaries as Tucker Carlson, Peter Thiel, what's his name was there? John Bolton was there. That's great.
John Bolton was there. John O'Sullivan, my friend Dan McCarthy. There are a lot of people. Yoram Hazony is the big one. He's kind of the force behind the whole thing. But Yuval Levin, Rich Lowry from National Review. It's kind of an odd hodgepodge mix of people, but they all came together under this idea of national conservatism.
So what? Do you mind if I read the? Here, let me read this part. It says. You wrote, "What is national conservatism all about?" And you said the succinct answer is the marriage of nationalism to conservatism. That seems very simple. But it says that the conference organizers define nationalism as a commitment to a world of independent nations. Mm-hmm. When you look at what these people who were here were preaching, does that correspond with what they were saying?
So I haven't heard all the speeches to be able to tell you exactly what kind of consistency there was between speakers. But I think what they are responding to, what they had in common, with the exception of people like John Bolton, I'm not sure exactly where he would fall into this in light of the fact that Yoram Hazony announced independence from both neoconservatism and libertarianism and said this is kind of our declaration of independence from those things. But in general, I think what the participants were uniting against is this idea of supranational government, things like the EU, the European Union, or some sort of form of government that would sort of be overarching, that would be based on allegedly universal principles to which varying countries would be subject. And I think that's what they're against, these big international organizations that are kind of run by elites, societal elites from different areas, and that are characterized by maybe cosmopolitanism. And so these are the things that they were writing and speaking against. And that in itself, I don't think is problematic, but I do think it's problematic to try to form a movement in the United States of America based on national conservatism. And that's because, as my article says, the United States is not a nation. I think if there is such thing as nationalism in the United States, then it's going to begin on local communities. I think the United States of America itself is a form of those sort of supra-governmental frameworks that within which local communities are sort of, I don't want to use the word conscripted, but they're, the United States of America tends to try to stamp out cultural uniqueness and differentiations and local idiosyncrasies. And it has had a centralizing effect rather than a decentralizing effect. I think common to most nationalism movements, you would tend to see movements toward self-determination or secession or separatism and things like that, which are the opposite of what you see in the United States, which has been since at least the Civil War about consolidating power. At the earliest years of the United States, you actually seem to have disparate communities existing independently, but relatively peacefully. And there wasn't until the different periods, Civil War, World War II. These were eras in which mass consolidation took place. But to say that there could be such a thing as national conservatism in the United States doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because I don't think the United States is a nation in the sense in which that term was traditionally applied. And I think in the article I defined a nation as something involving solidarity among people where they have a common language, ethnicity, descent, history, values, customs, mores, traditions. And the people within a nation are sort of culturally homogenous, and they're aware of their similarities. So I saw comments in the comment box after the article saying, well, the United States sure looks like a nation to me. If someone invaded Texas, I'm sure people in California would be fighting for it. And that kind of misses the point. I mean, if you want to start thinking nations, I think it's helpful to start thinking of like the Seminole Nation, the Cherokee Nation, the Choctaw Nation. This gives you a sense of sort of the tribal elements of nation. I mean, if you're going to look at countries that have nationalism, Japan might be the closest to having nationalism in countries. So the cultural and the actual borders uniting. And that's because Japan's an island. Another helpful thing to look at might be the historical nation of Israel, even though Israel had its own 12 tribes, each with their own forms of nationalism. So even that model is not exactly accurate, as probably my friend Stephen Crosby up at Clemson would likely point out. But one thing is that the nation of Israel in biblical terms did have a self-awareness, and it went through multiple forms of government. So nationalism doesn't have to be tied to a particular form of government. Ancient Israelites had a tribal confederacy under Moses and the Exodus, and then there was rule by judges after Joshua establishes the sort of political community in the Promised Land. And there's monarchy. Samuel was the last of the judges, and so and then you have kings. You have Saul and David, but the form of government is not necessarily tied to nationalism. Nationalism is much more about cultural cohesion. It's about people who identify themselves according to blood and kin and community and religion and tradition. And actually, the word nationalism comes from a Latin word, natio or natio, which refers to race or birth. So there is something that is, almost based on familial or sort of its derivative through kin and clan and that kind of thing. So I think nationalism is at root tribalist.
When you take into consideration what they're saying here about, you wrote that they presented national conservatism as an intellectually serious alternative to the excesses of purist libertarianism and in stark opposition to theories grounded in race.
Right. So what the National Conservatives are clearly trying to do is distance themselves from people who are quote unquote white nationalists, because obviously when people see the word nationalist, they're going to link that term with terms like white nationalists. And so the organizers are careful to distance themselves from any kind of race-based form of nationalism. And I think they're obviously right to do so. But I think that, they also can't ignore the fact that nationalism is characteristically tied to things like ethnicity. Historically, it always has been. When you look at some of those nations that I mentioned, the nation of Israel, the Choctaw Nation, the Seminole Nation, the Cherokee Nation, even when there was, the Celtic influence under Scottish nationalism, where there's Baltic and Slavic nationalism and Greek nationalism and Norse and, the Goths and, all these people were united by their own common descent as much as they were by any kind of principle or idea. So there's a difference between like patriotism and nationalism. Nationalism, people are going to have this sense of pride and solidarity almost no matter what the group to which they're tied or to which they're bound does or believes, whereas patriotism is more of a pride in a country or a group because of what the country stands for, because of what the group does, because of the principles. So people can have patriotism, for example, for the United States of America, because they value freedom, or they value liberty, or they understand a constitutional sense of government, or separation of powers, or checks and balances, and they appreciate these forms of really liberalism. I mean, the United States of America is a product of historical liberalism, and so when people talk about any sort of unity under the United States, and I know this may seem to be in tension with what I said earlier about the United States in those periods in which it consolidated and became sort of mass centralization, but the United States of America, as it's understood against that mass centralization tendency, would be understood in terms of historic liberalism and some of these ideas that I just talked about. Everything from due process, or everything coming from Magna Carta to the Bill of Rights, English Bill of Rights, to the Petition of Rights, to the theories of Locke and Mill and many others, and then Enlightenment rationalism and different forms of Christianity and the freedoms that were promoted by separatists and dissident groups who felt that state-controlled churches were oppressive. So they're just, it's difficult to talk about the United States of America because it has so many disparate traditions, so many different influences, so many different regions, so many different thinkers, that it really is difficult to talk about the United States of America as a nation. The difficulty you have when you try to start talking about it and as a nation is that it just contains so many multiplicities that every sort of attempt at an overarching uniformity or a sort of a universal idea of the United States ends up breaking down.
Do you want to try and take apart this obsession that's happened recently with like Tucker Carlson attacking libertarians, mentioning Austrians by name, and their little thing here about the excesses of purist libertarianism? When it comes to the United States, what are they talking about?
Well, I mean, I think, which is interesting, since Tucker Carlson used to be deeply involved with the Cato Institute up until not very long ago. But, I think that there are canards and caricatures of libertarians that are out there. And as with all kinds of stereotypes, some of them contain a little bit of truth. But I think really there is a strand of libertarianism that consists of kind of what we would say libertinism, or people that try to conflate liberalism in terms of social values with libertarianism. And the way I view libertarianism is that it does not necessarily entail any sort of social values whatsoever. I mean, when it comes to issues like traditional versus same-sex marriage, or whether the family is the basic unit of society, and things like that, libertarianism doesn't infringe upon a culturally conservative view of those things. And I think someone like Murray Rothbard, in fact, shows that there could be a compatibility, or even a Hayek, which shows that, well, you have these decentralized communities, and some you might have cultural conservatism, and others you might have sort of cultural liberalism in terms of progressivism. I'm not speaking in terms of political theory and economic liberalism, but that you would have a variety of competing jurisdictions, and that people would be sort of self-governing within their own sovereign communities, and they could take whatever their social values are in different directions. That I see as being actually compatible with the type of libertarianism that maybe someone like Tucker Carlson is advocating. Now, Tucker Carlson is kind of in a unique case because obviously he's a big Fox News celebrity and has to do what he does to gain viewership. You know, he's shifted his political positions all over the place over the years, and it always seems to be in keeping with whatever the zeitgeist is. It's whatever's going to keep him in the headlines and make him popular. So I don't know how much credibility he has with me, but he's recently praised sort of the economic nationalism of an Elizabeth Warren, and that to me is troubling because for obvious reasons. But in short, I don't understand exactly what they mean when they're targeting purist libertarians, because A, they're not naming people by name, B, they're not describing what they mean by libertarianism, they're not defining libertarianism, but people tend, who are not libertarians, tend to have really strong feelings about libertarianism because of people they know who are libertarians or things they've read about libertarianism, without being necessarily fully informed about what libertarianism entails, or how many different schools are within libertarianism. I mean, libertarianism is infamous among libertarians for all the infighting and the factions. And so, if you're not saying what libertarianism are we talking about here? Are we talking about Milton Friedman's? Are we talking about Ludwig von Mises's? Are we talking about anarcho-capitalism? Are we talking about anarcho-syndicalism? I mean, Noam Chomsky has referred to himself as a libertarian. So there's just so many varieties of libertarianism that, just declaring yourself free from libertarianism really in itself is meaningless. The other thing I've noticed is that there was a lot of condemnation at this conference of big corporations and corporate America and big tech. And to me, it's not consistent to say we're going to attack libertarianism and we're going to attack those things because, big corporations, big monopolies, big companies that are enjoying government privileges and that are doing spying for governments and all these kinds of things. These things amass their power because of governments. They could never gain that kind of power or control were it not for governments. These things are not products of libertarianism. In fact, these types of companies and these types of corporations would fear the free market, because in a free market, they would never be able to amass such power.
I don't understand how they can make that argument that, everybody hates corporations, and then, they're becoming monopolistic. And it's like, well, why are they becoming monopolistic? I thought Milton Friedman solved this once and for all when he was on Donahue that one time, and they asked him about monopolies. And it just makes no sense. But I want to go back to talking about smaller units. Mises said self-determination should be created at the local level.
Right.
So why in this country, is it because of the Civil War? Why is it that when you bring up secession and breaking it up, conservatives and progressives and, loony right and loony left, they all bristle at it? Why is that?
Well, I do think the Civil War is the primary reason. I think that America's history of slavery has made any sort of political decentralization problematic to argue about, because there's always the rhetorical move of conflating political decentralization or self-determination with the issue of slavery, or with the issue of civil rights, in the 60s, and the sort of the states' rights movement that was popular among segregationists and things like that. So I think that the unfortunate racial history in the United States has caused discussions of decentralization to be difficult, extremely difficult and extremely sensitive. And it's almost, I think, more helpful to look at other countries and other regions of the world and look at political decentralization in those areas and discuss, what has been beneficial or constructive, and what has been sort of oppressive. I mean, we could look at the breakup of the former Soviet Union, or there are any number of examples, but the United States of America just has a history in which these political categories have all involved racial questions, and that has just made the topic extremely difficult for most Americans, and especially in a culture in which the mainstream media tries to stir up such controversy and tries to label people and really tries to prevent rational discourse rather than facilitate it. I mean, reasonable people acting in good faith ought to be able to have serious scholarly conversations about these subjects, because political decentralization is an inevitability. Secession of some form or another is an inevitability. There is no country that has always existed in its own form, no nation which has always existed in its own form, and political boundaries are always ultimately arbitrary and fluid, and they will always be redrawn. I mean, it would be a mistake to think that in 500 years the United States of America will contain the exact same boundaries as they do today. I mean, so we know that they're going to change, and we need to be able to talk openly and intelligently about how they might change and along what lines, and in which regions are there cultural differentiations and distinctions and values that might differ from other regions, and is there a way for these places to achieve self-determination peacefully, without resort to violence and without resort to coercion? Because what you don't want to see is different regions becoming so unique and so distinct that some sort of central power tries to coerce them into remaining within the political unit. And that would necessarily involve violence. You want as many communities, self-defining communities, to exist peacefully and independently, and to work together. You want to facilitate economic cooperation. You want to facilitate peaceful relations, and you can't do that if people are not allowed to decide for themselves how they want to govern themselves.
If you enjoy the show and you feel like you're benefiting from it, please consider supporting it at patreon.com/ManceRaider or at bitbacker.io/user/Pete Raymond. You can do that with cryptocurrency there, or on my website, freemanbeyondthewall.com/store. You can support it with PayPal or with cryptocurrency there, and you can pay for the year. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think of like Manhattan in the early 1900s and late 1800s, and how it almost seemed like there were whole neighborhoods that were different countries. And I remember reading of German neighborhoods would not only, all the Germans wouldn't only go into one neighborhood, where you would have a northern German neighborhood and there'd be a block where people from, the South would congregate. And but like you say in this article, I mean, you just start talking about all the different kind of all the cultures that are here, and from the Creole in New Orleans to Orthodox Jewish communities. I mean, there are Orthodox Jewish communities in New York City that have their own police force.
Yeah.
Yeah, they police their own neighborhoods. Then you talk about, everybody, the Amish, Puerto Ricans, South Americans. I mean, the question always comes down to, do they have a common culture? Even when you're talking about liberty and you're talking about the Constitution, I mean, all you have to do is go watch the debates, the Democratic debates this week, to realize there's not one culture in this country, and no one's falling under the culture of liberty and the Constitution and it's laughable limited government.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think we have a variety of heterogeneous cultures. I mean, they're just multiplicity after multiplicities within multiplicities within multiplicities in the United States of America, and it is pretty miraculous. I mean, that the country has held together under the Constitution, which is the longest surviving national constitution, as in terms of a constitution that governs an entire country. It is remarkable that it has lasted this long and had as few amendments as it has had. But to the extent that the people have been bound together under that, it has been because of a commitment to principles of governance, like some of those that I listed at the beginning. Separation of powers, checks and balances, popular sovereignty, rule of law. These are big, kind of grand principles, but they emerged over time and in response to all kinds of different political conflicts, in particular in British history, but also in the broader history of Europe. And in that sense, the United States of America, you could say, yeah, it's the product of Western ideas, but that doesn't make it something that fits into that nation category. You might be able to argue that it's a nation state. I mean, the nation state as a model is a form of government that sort of arose in the 17th century. The Treaty of Westphalia is the one that, if you look at scholars of international law, they always kind of start with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, say, well, this is the beginning of when we start talking about international law. And, that was at the end of these European religious wars and wars between Catholics and Protestants. And after it, you saw the establishment of different regions. And there was the facilitation of kind of a stable diplomatic system consisting of peace among coexisting nations. But the nation state model is not something that's just been around forever. I mean, before the nation state, you saw empires, Austrian Empire, Ottoman Empire, British Empire, and these were characterized by absolute monarchies, or like shoguns in Japan, or the caliphates in the Islamic world. But the nation state does have something about it that is a distinctly kind of modern version of nationalism, you might say. There's a I don't know if he was a sociologist or a historian. His name was Carlton Hayes, and he wrote a book called Nationalism and Religion. And he died a long time ago, in 1964. He died he's a 20th century guy, but he studied nationalism. And he argued that nationalism in its modern form is different from some of these sort of ancient tribal forms of nationalism that I talked about earlier, the Greek and the Celtic and the Norse and the ancient Israelite and all whatever else. But he argued that this new form of nationalism is sort of supplanting or substituting for nationalism that was previously based around religious identity, that as the world becomes increasingly secular, people are replacing religion with these forms of political community. And that's interesting because it really presents a difficult challenge to more universalist religions like Christianity. And I say Christianity as universalist in the sense that, Jesus Christ taught that anybody can be saved, no matter where they're from, no matter who they are, no matter how bad they were, no matter what they did, as long as they believed that Jesus Christ was Lord and Savior, they could get to heaven through him. So it didn't matter where you're from. So in that sense, Christianity was a religion that broke down barriers and that allowed people to be more cosmopolitan. And I use cosmopolitan not in the sense in which we hear it so much today, and sort of just the casual use, but in the sense of, being cosmopolitan is being aware that there are people in other places that see the world differently than you do, and therefore you ought to be mindful of their perspectives and not a jingoist or a chauvinist or whatever. And in that sense, cosmopolitanism is not even incompatible with nationalism. If you are a nationalist and you believe that your cultural values, norms, mores, institutions, whatever, are superior to others, but you can still believe that and say, but I recognize that somebody else from another part of the world or from some other community might believe the same way I do about their own communities. And just being mindful of that enables us to approach problems or potential problems with a sense of humility and mutual respect rather than violence or coercion or any sort of potential threat.
Opinion question. We talk about breaking up secession.
Mm-hmm.
In the modern day, in this political environment, what one or two things do you think would start really getting the ball rolling? I mean, we're not just threatening. It's like, we're going to do this.
Well, there was a pretty big movement to get a referendum on California's ballot to break up California. I know there were the Cal Exit people like Marcus Evans who are involved, but there were also there are a lot of organizations that were involved in that. And I think when you see movements, for example, in Puerto Rico, where Puerto Ricans want to be independent, you see some of those movements in Hawaii where they say, well, what do we have to do with the United States of America? We're basically an occupied territory. We don't say anything because we get the economic benefits and we get a military protecting us, but we really don't want to be culturally assimilated into the United States. That doesn't represent us, the mainland United States. So I think that you just, the short answer is I don't know, but I think you're just seeing it starting to happen as it begins to happen in places, the Brexit. We'll see how Boris Johnson does as PM. We'll see if he's able to, our prime minister, I say PM, but his prime minister. But we'll see if he's able to accomplish Brexit. But some of these movements that are like that in both Europe and elsewhere, Bolsonaro in Brazil, for example, we'll see what they're able to, bring into play. I mean, gradually, the parameters of acceptability are expanding, and people are starting to realize that some of these separatist movements are based on peace and cooperation, and they're not militaristic. They're not bellicose. They are just seeking peaceful self-determination. And maybe it takes some international examples. It's funny because Americans tend to always try to copy Europe and follow Europe, and we're always about 50 years behind them. So once nationalism caught on in Europe, you still had people like Justice Breyer writing all this stuff about international law and all this Europe this and supranational. And in the meantime, Europe was getting much more tribal and nationalist and was responding to a lot of the immigration from, for example, Muslim countries, and was actually, European nations were erecting borders and trying to protect their culture. And as this is happening, Breyer is still waxing poetically as if, we were, trying to institute some Woodrow Wilson vision or something. I mean, so we Americans are kind of late to the game when we try to copy Europe rather than trying to do things our own way. And again, I know I'm using terms like we and in America that in ways that may seem at tension with my claims earlier, but at a certain point you have to sort of choose words and label in order to actually have a conversation. But yeah, I don't know is the short answer, but I suspect that you'll start seeing some changes. I mean, we're getting to a point now where the United States of America is becoming so divided politically and culturally that you just have to ask: is there a better way? Is there a way where we don't have to fight all the time and about these kinds of issues? Is there a way that maybe some places can go off and try to do it their way? If you want to have a Ocasio-Cortez style socialism, Bernie Sanders style socialism, maybe you can go live in a place where that happens. And maybe it'll become like current Venezuela, maybe it won't. I don't know. But at least those people would be able to go experiment in the way they want to experiment. Whereas, if other regions want to embrace the free market, then as I believe, they will enjoy the benefits of that over time. And we'll just see in practice which system is superior, but at least allow, regional distinctions to institutionalize without trying to coerce people into some sort of artificial uniformity through a centralized apparatus. I think that is a dangerous way, because when people start feeling that they are being coerced or forced into political arrangements that force them to violate their conscience, for example, we'll talk about the same-sex marriage example or baking of wedding cakes or whatever that is. When people start feeling that central governments are forcing them to violate their own conscience or to defy their own religion or whatever it is, then you're going to get in a place where resistance is going to become a possibility. And with resistance, there's usually violence. And so I think we need to start asking big questions. We need to start saying that these topics are on the table, that reasonable people can have reasonable discussions about these things, that these are not just bad people that talk about these things, that good people looking for right answers ought to be able to, in good faith, have these conversations. But, in the mass media and academia, even where actual academic freedom is supposed to flourish, you see a suppression of political ideas. And people don't want to ask certain questions because they just don't.
It seems like there are factions on both sides of the aisle that would reject secessionism just because they want to dominate the other side. They want to be able to hold, an iron fist over them.
Well, if you look at Brexit, a lot of the big business interests and the big banks, it creates a destabilizing effect. And at least for a time, we won't know what the long-term effects are. But of course, the way they do business is destabilized, and that could have lots of different unforeseen consequences. And so, status quo is always easier. And people who have amassed power, people who have gotten wealthy through, let's call it a corrupt system, just to do it, they don't want to see that kind of stuff undone. They don't want to see power restored to the people. They like having the control of the few and being able to sort of profit off of the little guy. We'll put it that way.
Oh. Well, I think that was a lot of information, and it's something that
it was. I know, and it's hard. Again, we're painting such a big brush, and I apologize for doing that. But it's a difficult conversation to have, but an important one.
Well, and it's one that people don't want to hear a lot of times because it's so foreign to them. 12 mandatory years of government school, of government indoctrination just gets you thinking a certain way. And, sometimes when I think about the people that come to liberty and how I came to, be an anarchist and everything, I almost compare it to like Calvinism and, irresistible grace or something like that, like where it's almost like something from outside of you has to change your heart and your mind because it's so, it's drilled into you from the youngest age.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, and I advocate the reading of philosophy for a lot of reasons. People that you disagree with, people that you agree with, mainly because it broadens your horizons and it makes you think at a deeper level about, okay, well, what are these political arrangements that characterize our current moment? And are they inevitable? No, not necessarily. We've had lots of different political arrangements and different forms of governments over history. And we've seen that, there was a time when not having a monarchy would have been inconceivable, or not having, empire would have been inconceivable. How would, who would protect the provinces and what? But, people evolve and different institutions emerge in response to new cultural climates, new technologies, new states of the world, different cultural paradigms and shifts, and different geopolitical alliances force people to have to rethink institutions. And so I say, why not read widely? Why not expand the parameters of possibility and really think critically about whether the institutions that exist are the best ones for the present moment? And if not, how can they be changed in ways that are peaceful and not radical? I mean, nobody wants a French Revolution. That was a radical situation. But how can gradual steps be taken toward change that's peaceful? And that ought always to be the goal. Sometimes it's difficult because you've got people that want to implement radical change and they want to do it through violence and terrorism or whatever, and that presents a completely different set of circumstances that you have to deal with. But the goal ought to be, how do we adapt to different kinds of changes in a way that maximizes rather than minimizes individual freedom.
As Ron Paul pretty much answers every question, people just need more individual freedom and more liberty, and their lives, their pursuit of happiness is going to be a lot easier, and they'll get things done, and everyone will get things done. I mean, it's really when we look at what is going on now and what's holding us back, I mean, a lot of it is just government regulation, and a lot of it is, monopoly and patents and things like that are just keeping the status quo. And the status quo has never been what we should be striving for.
Yeah, I mean, I say to students sometimes, if you take as your premise the dignity and bodily integrity of every human person, and you respect and value the life of every human person as your starting point, and then you extrapolate from that and try to figure out what institutions or systems ought to work, respecting always that first premise, then you're probably writ large going to achieve a more functional and constructive society. But if you start denying the dignity of every human person, or trying to diminish the value of certain human lives, then you will find that pretty quickly you start going down the path of coercion and destruction. And so, the very starting point is so important.
Yeah, I think we should end it right there. I mean, that was just a perfect place to stop. So, Alan Mendenhall, really appreciate it. Thank you, and try and get you back on again sometime.
Sounds great. Thank you very much.
I want to thank you for tuning into the Free Man Beyond the Wall podcast. I want to thank Alan for coming on. That's it. Be back in a few days with another show. Take care, and bye.